Hey Slayers, welcome to week 1 of the Empress Fiction podcast, where we're going to be starting with Bifrost, a tale of heroism threaded by fate's knotted hands. Heaven and earth fear the coming of Ragnarok, centuries in the making as feuds bloom between family and mortal enemies alike. The Allfather sends his finest Valkyrie and ordains her with a fate-changing task. The King of Men prepares his home for invasion and finds that survival is a centuries-long game. None escape fate's designs. Ooh, good blurb. What are we thinking?
Ooh, it's going to be a spicy one.
It's going to
be a spicy meatball, that's for sure.
I agree with you on that. I'm getting very spicy from this, and not because I wrote it.
Before we dive head in to Bifrost, tell us a little bit about it. Who are the main characters? What are the plot points? Thematically, what are we kind of looking at here?
Sure. So, as it is with mythology, and such a big reason why I love it is you're dealing with fate. Everything is tying back into fate. Because you're going into this story and these characters are really, really strong. They're really opinionated, of course. You're working with Vikings, gods, goddesses, that type of thing. And they're so sure what their path in life is. And I myself wrote this at a time in my life where I was probably very unsure about what I wanted and how I wanted to achieve it. So it really just struck a chord with me, this idea of fate and manipulating fate in a way where you think you're the master of it, but it's taking you places where you were meant to be all along. So with this story, we have two main characters. We have Astrid, Odin's daughter, very looked after, very cared for by her friends, family, and she is obsessed with the idea of getting her father's approval. Of course, you're talking about the Allfather, very hard to please, likes his own way. And then the King of Men, who's going to teach her what it means to be in touch with her human side and humanity and taking a look at the bigger picture.
Now, we have an idea and that's the main character.
Those are the main characters. Yes.
All right. Paint me an image.
Paint you an image.
Paint me an image.
I'm not fucking Bobby Ross. Paint your own goddamn image.
You're the author here.
I mean, I don't know how you get more vivid than that. We're dealing, for our bookish community, we're dealing with fated lovers. Well, of course, we're dealing with some spicy scenes, like we mentioned before, but we're also dealing with really a saga. It's going to give you Lord of the Rings. It's going to give you the Iliad, and you better strap in for it. And JP, tell them where they can find it. Where can we find this book? You wanted a nickname. I gave you a nickname.
I literally said I didn't want a nickname.
You got a nickname. And of course, as usual, you can find this week's featured novel on SlayerPublishing.com, along with a lot of great other works too.
Alright, so we're going to hop right into it?
Yeah, let's hop into it. Of course, at the beginning of the book, we have some wonderful maps. I made these myself. I was very impressed. It was a hard process, but I think they came out really well. What do you think?
Oh, stunning. Gorgeous.
Yeah.
Really true.
You got some mountains, some valleys, some rivers.
A little bit of water on the side.
A little bit of water, things that entail land. Yep. And we've got a map of the 9 realms. There are 9 realms in Norse mythology. 9. And here we are. We're starting part 1, which is based in Qarth. So on our map here, you can follow along at the same time. Qarth, that's going to be where a lot of our human beings reside. Things that are familiar to you. Men, farmers, they're really big on agriculture in the human lands that are central. We've also got Narethal, that's going to be...
Can you pronounce that? Can you
syllables?
I
don't think...
Can you use it in a sentence?
Can I use Narethal in a sentence? No, because I made it up. Next question. I think the biggest takeaway from this is there are 4 lands. 1, we've got elves. Elves as you know them, leafy, by the sea, very in tune with nature. Those are going to be in Vertan. That's to the west. You have the human lands that are Qarth. That's central. We have Yahtzee, which is dwarves in the south. We're thinking coves, mining, that towards a thing. Yahtzee! No, Yahtzee. Yahtzee.
This is why I asked for syllables.
Yes. Yahtzee. And then Narethal, which are elves, but we're going to get into why they're just a little bit different here. They kind of lurk in the mountains, We're thinking some dark magic has occurred and Mayhaps it has altered them drastically.
Don't spoil anything.
We're going to find that out quick, fast, in a hurry. So no spoilers here.
All right.
Let's get into it. Part 1, Karth. Chapter 1, Night's Heat. Midgard. Scattered rain showers descended from gray, thundering clouds onto the rolling green plains of Haverslav. The battleground took a different form in the dim light. What was once assuredly lively and quite nearly serene was now only a whisper of its original beauty, buried beneath abandoned human vessels. Astrid's heavy, rain-soaked black cape trailed behind her as she stepped through the battle-worn field. The tips of her golden helm caught rays of sunlight that were scarcely there. Through the tall, blood-soaked grass beneath the gold of her sandals were warriors with milky, glazed-over eyes, staring blankly up into the clouds with mouths agape, catching the tears of the sky. She said a prayer to the gods as the rain came down harder on their blue flesh, and mud began to cake their now useless armor. I implore you, Freya, mistress of battle and adorner of love, let the faithful join you in your afterlife to rest. Let my chosen Odin, All-Father, serve faithfully in Valhalla to await Ragnarok. She repeated her whispers of prayer as she walked amongst the lost souls, pulling long swords and arrows from their bodies as she blessed them, preparing them for their journey onward. When she completed her walk through the no longer desecrated fallen, she lifted her hands towards the sky, allowing the rainwater to form rivets down her brown fingertips. Her golden eyes followed their focus to their thunderheads above the field. With the deepest of breaths, she set the bodies aflame. The ruby eternal flames did not waver from the watershed of the sky. Astrid watched them dance in the circle she had made surrounding herself, and with a small twitch of her finger, she sent the destructive energy forward, allowing it to consume the shells of life that had ceased their purpose. This was the last gift she felt she could bestow to the mortals that would be unable to reap the benefits of war they had begun. The history of men was painted vividly with slaughter. Death was only a tool for negotiation, and worshipping their gods only a last resort to protect them from their comeuppance. She pitied those left behind, families awaiting their warriors to return home, knowing that while they cheered and sang of their bravery, their loved ones were being burned and devoted to serve the gods in their armies when it was time for this world to come to an end. The cycle of battle never truly ended, and yet men dedicated their dreams to this malformed view of heaven, serving gods who cared nothing for their sacrifices. Astrid was torn. As a Valkyrie, she knew death was not personal. It would come for them all as the fates willed it. Battle could be honorable and necessary when stability and the greater good was questioned, and Valhalla was a warrior's dream, the highest honor a mortal could hope for. But deep in her heart, a small part of her that she rarely cared to listen to, felt personal turmoil for each person as they turned to ash. Their faces fell away, crumbling into the grass beneath. The rivers of blood dried and lifted into the sky to return to the universe that birthed them. Their lives seemed so meaningless and short, with happiness that was even more temporary. Why force their euphoric forever in the heavens to instead be spent awaiting another great war? Whispered wind called to her, swirling around her bronze collarbone and grazing her earlobe before it carried on towards the sky. She heard her father's voice carried in a shimmering gust. She turned in a circle slowly amongst the fading savagery, taking in the sadness and hope that lived there. The fire she had called were no more than Empress now, with only ash left behind to tell of the battle that had taken place. Her work there was done. Astrid reached out to feel the gust still swirling through her hair and around her arms, allowing it to speak to her once more. "Come to me," it whispered in her father's voice again, and so she would. Unafraid as light engulfed her, she began to feel the wind of the great tree whipping harshly around her with scents of fire, rain, decay, and growth. She closed her eyes and waited for the feeling to pass. The Bifrost took its toll with each trip. Your senses remained your own only if you gave it the control it briefly desired. Astrid felt her feet touch solid ground and opened her eyes. Trees, gnarled and tall, waterfalls, boasting and strong, and halls of gold and marble welcomed her return. The dream-filled sky had just been brushed with magenta with the passing of the sun. The air Asgardians were blessed with high on Yggdrasil, the great world tree above the other 8 realms, was sweet. It was said amongst the Aesir that no place was as heavenly and perfectly made. Asgard was the highest blessing, and each world beneath it on the Yggdrasil's branches and rich stem were undesirable. In her own travels, Astrid had not seen a world to rival it yet. The warmth of the silver torches lining the walls of the porcelain throne reached the apple of her cheeks and shone on her skin as the blue flames danced in their holsters. Bronze portraits of Asgardians both alive and long past decorated the ceilings and walls, made entirely out of shining graphite. She looked into their frames as she made her way further down the entrance hallway towards the empty throne. Astrid did not have a portrait of her own. No demigod had yet been blessed with a place in the hall, but she was sure she would be the first. She had only to prove she was exceptional. Her time would come. Astrid stopped in front of the throne where her father's picture rested high in the banisters. She habitually compared their complexions. He was alabaster, looming, with piercing blue eyes that spoke of power and legacy. Her complexion was far from pale, with warm red skin in its undertones and blessed golden brown eyes from her human mother. She had been told countlessly that she was a reflection of her, with a slim upturned nose and full lips like those in her mother's homeland far across the sea in the sunlands of Midgard, where trees were sparse and desert roamed. She never truly knew if those who reminded her of her differences meant to spit hatred or praise. But she knew for certain that many thought better of acknowledging it, lest her father question them on what made her so different from them all, as if it wasn't evident with one glance. Astrid was not of them. She had never known her mother, but through her story, and the searches she had gone through in her early years to find out more about her, Astrid knew she was almost her exact image. She too had deep ebony hair that curled into itself far down her back with eyes of golden pools that reflected every band of light that they sought. As Odin's body began appearing, Astrid removed her gold leaf helm and let her hair fall down her back. She held the metal to her hip as light and wind swirled around the empty silver-lined throne. His scraggly braided blonde beard hung to his belly, and his dark green armor rattled against the seat of power. A parted smile was painted into his aged cheeks. He looked happy, just as he usually did when she returned from collecting his offerings. His laugh boomed as he stood up just as quickly as he had sat, and moved forward to embrace her with his outstretched arms. Odin's white teeth and blue eyes shone as he called to her. Astrid! His arms wrapped around her and lifted her high off the ground. Even in his humanoid form he towered over her. But most pure gods did. What a wondrous battle. The warriors are very talented from this day. I'm very pleased. She smiled with him as he squeezed. His affection was not easily given, even to her, although her brother swore he loved her best. She hugged him in return. I'm pleased you're pleased, father. I'm always happy to serve you. She eyed the banisters behind them as he only continued to squeeze in silence. Had he only called to thank her? He had never done so before. Father? She called as he shook her again. Odin returned her to her feet and touched her padded shoulder. Astrid was sure for one moment he looked to be happy enough to shed tears. The moment ended with another squeeze from his grip. You did well today, daughter. Allow your poor father a moment to see that you're unharmed. Let our troubles rest. Astrid nodded happily. I am well. Observing the battle was as simple as you said, although strange. Odin motioned for her to follow as he walked past the throne towards the reception hall. Strange? Astrid nodded to the servants that opened the double doors and whispered their greeting to the Allfather. The men are coming undone, feuding about breaking their treaty with the elves and dwarves. All as you said, but their king, who does not like to be called king, he seems full of resolve and strength. Are you certain he is meant to be ours before Ragnarok? She watched her father for his response. Odin's smile faltered. He stopped walking amongst the pillars surrounding the tables and chairs filled with spirits and gods alike, drinking and singing. His stare stilled her at his side. He will serve me. Was I not clear when I told you this? She nodded and shook away the chill from his glare and the smile that did not reach his eyes. It was not her place to question him. I am sorry, father. Odin's grip on her arm stopped her from kneeling at his feet with humility. She stood straight once more. It will be done as you ask. Odin released her with a small chuckle. This I do not doubt. Their walk continued. As the commander of the Valkyries, I can entrust this to no one but you, my daughter. I am continuously pleased with how strong you have become. Astrid smiled faintly. You honor me, father. I live to serve you. And just as you serve me, so must others, Odin added, gesturing to the Aesir in the sunlit hall. It is the way you aid in preserving all you see here in Asgard and out in the realms where battles call. This duty is not above the mortals of Midgard, you or even myself." He looked at her and waved the illusion over his missing eye away. Astrid looked directly into the once festered hole, cleaned and emptied of the eye that he had lost in trade for knowledge of their future. She did not look away as the wound compelled her. Odin had only told her and her brothers the story once after his return from the well. She remembered the hush around the great hall as Thor carried her in her nightdress beside Loki. Astrid had been young, too young to understand the importance of the temporary truce her brothers had made to collect her together and take her to Odin's chambers. There they sat around their father's bedside as he recounted his journey, sparing no details. It had taken him until dawn. When his tale was over, he had explained why he felt he, and he alone, could bear the weight of the sacrifice, and the importance of maintaining their legacy with every event that would come to follow. His future sight had not been wrong yet, and if Odin was certain the king of men would be his, Astrid was as well. The look in Odin's eyes bored holes into her skin. The Lord King Verduke of Grothin has land that is central in Qarth. His birthline is very old, and he is essential to the human colonies of Midgard. War has reached his borders, and today the men who turned on him for not breaking faith with their immortal allies have now been defeated. This is only the very beginning of his victories. Each one will strengthen him, and songs of his valor will be sung for centuries to come when the war for Midgard is won. Then he will lead his fallen brethren for Asgard when Ragnarok attempts to claim her. The moment in which you will bring him to me will be made clear, but you are not to leave his side until then." Astrid attempted to hide her shock. Valkyrie companions were not unheard of for great battles in which gods saw fit to interfere, but to aid a king through the entirety of his war? "Father, you will be his healer, his mage, his potions master, whatever you must be to earn his trust and claim a place by his side. He cannot know of his fate, even if you are discovered. He is highly suspicious and untrusting. He will not come willingly if you have deceived him. Do you understand?" Astrid closed her mouth and nodded again. "Yes, All-Father." Odin watched as she lowered her gaze and returned his false eye illusion to his face. "Leave when you have prepared and said your goodbyes. It will be some time before you will be able to return without his notice." He saw her look up again in a panic and felt no remorse. She was young for an Aesir god, but was long past her time to prove her utmost fealty. "It seems an opportunity to prove your dedication has come, Astrid. You will not refuse its challenge, will you?" She shook her head. "No, Father. It shall be done as you ask." Astrid felt only dread as she made her promise. This was far unlike anything her father had asked of her before. Did that speak to its importance, or its deviation from tradition? Odin hugged her again. "I'm so glad that we understand each other, daughter." He paused and glanced at her false smile. "Do not return without my treasure." He smiled broadly as he began to dematerialize. The gust of wind and light from the Bifrost. He was gone. Kirk sang low along to the folk song his men were clapping and whistling to as they danced around the roasting pit. He lifted his spilling flagon to the ceiling and cheered as someone took the buxom maid bringing quail and bread and kissed her roughly. He chuckled, the food hitting the mixed stone floor, and hounds quickly descended on it. Her long blonde braids swung as she laughed and sang in the man's arms, with eyes of cheerful blue that smiled with her every word. Seeing a pretty woman after battle brought liveliness to his chest each and every time they returned home. That unique, oblivious happiness was far unlike the sadness that was sure to settle in the next morning. Kirk is such a goddamn savage sometimes. Seeing a pretty woman after battle. I can't read it. I can't read it. Okay. Seeing a pretty woman. Okay. Seeing a pretty woman after battle brought liveliness to his chest each and every time they returned home. That unique, oblivious happiness was far unlike the sadness that was sure to settle in the next morning. The drunk, lumbering man next to him leaned over and wrapped his cloaked shoulder with his arm. Ale and meat stank on his breath. "She's a pretty one, isn't she?" Kirk nodded with his cousin beside him, but stayed silent. Eric's taste in women was not quite his own. but he agreed. Sing another one, Ilka. Kirk grinned as his men cheered and stood as Ilka clapped to their stomping rhythm and lifted her skirts to show the fine hairs on her peaking thighs. In the dim light of the great hall, with his family's banners watching over their camaraderie, he was thankful to be home. Eric gripped Kirk's shoulder as he looked deep in thought. He never truly knew what his cousin, his king, was thinking, and the burdens he often kept to himself. But he knew what troubles could lie there and would be presented in the future. You cannot allow Lord Hevar's turning to stray you, cousin. We swore an oath. He broke it. Kirk gave him a glance of acknowledgement. Septon Hevarth had broken his oath to Karth and to the Verduques, but his fear had not been unwarranted. Kirk knew how many of his people were afraid, just as Lord Hevarth had been. But Kirk knew breaking faith with the elves and dwarves was not the way to save the race of men. Septon used to come here as a child, do you remember? Eric's blond beard contorted with his boisterous laughter. Lord Hevarth had indeed spent many summers with Kirk and Eric when they were children. He was spoiled and proud, a terrible card player, and awful at sharing. But he was an honorable man, raised by a twice as honorable father. Lord Learth Hevarth made us apologize to Millie Geese, the cook's daughter, after we put a toad in her soup. Eric took a bite of his fish. I remember it as if it were yesterday. Kirk smiled and took another earthy sip. You were the one who put it there. Eric waved a hand. Yes, she was a fine-looking girl. She was my thirst, you know. Kirk rolled his eyes. He had heard this story many, many times before. The very first time they were hardly men. Eric came running with hay still in his hair from their midday romp in the secluded stables. My father had me watch for 2 months when he overheard you. I was always paying for your mistakes. Eric patted him on the back. Pride and love surged through him as he looked at Kirk's face. And still do, brother. Astrid felt the cobblestones of the courtyard appear beneath her feet and looked around to be sure her arrival had gone unnoticed. Her hair blew past her shoulder as she righted her human clothes. The moonlit night in Grothin carried a summer breeze. Warmth welcomed her as an uproar of laughter and singing poured from the weathered castle doors in front of her. The dim lanterns posted to either side of the great archway flickered and danced in the night, along with the quiet whispering of the trees lining the bricked walls of the entrance. As the door swung open, she quickly moved to the side and pulled her hooded cloak closer to her face, shielding herself from the drunken occupants straggling home from the king's lair. She clung to the stone wall as they giggled and passed, looking to the sky. The great mountains rested in the distance, their peaks kissing the star-covered sky that carried the lonely pale orb as it watched others bask in its reflected light. Astrid righted herself with slow breaths. She had only to do as her father asked. Then she could save her home, her family, and the other worlds, including Midgard. But even with her own reassuring words, an unsettling feeling lurked in her belly. She gathered herself and pulled the cold steel handle to open the hall door. Kirk looked up. Although the creaking of the hall doors could not be heard over the laughter and music, her energy alone shifted the air in the room. Her mind reached him first. Over the wants and needs of the other patrons, he could tell that she was searching. Searching for trouble or safety, he could not be sure. He watched on as she stepped and turned around his rowdy guests, examining each of their faces as she went by. She moved quietly, so gracefully that he could believe she wasn't touching the floor at all. Although he was head and shoulders beneath many of the people she passed, her height easily daunted other women he had met. Eric followed Kirk's eyes to the hooded woman making her way through the crowd. Were you expecting visitors, my king? An impressed smirk crossed Kirk's lips. I was not. Worried, Eric pushed his chair away from the head table and stood. Astrid swept the king's returned gaze. He was handsome, and seemed to be of a human age equivalent to herself. His deep black hair reminded her of the night sky she had just parted from, and his silver eyes shone like stars adorning it. With lips of pale pink and thick black brows that took a slash of blackened red scar through them, and his right eye all the way to his collarbone. As his blonde friend approached her, she unhappily took her eyes from Kirk. Lord Verduque isn't taking audience right now. Or somewhere else for the night, Eric coldly uttered from his rose lips. Freckled with blue eyes, he would have been handsome if not for his bitter soul. Kirk tilted his head as she only smiled up at Eric. Your men have no respect for women, Lord Verduque. Should I teach them to? Kirk smiled along with her malice. He loved a mean woman. He very nearly said yes. Let her through, Eric. He waved his men to settle and return to their drinking and good spirits. Astrid let her smile fall as she stared back at Eric and undid the string of her cloak, revealing a deep blue traveling dress that curved with her body and held to her chest. Bold blue sapphires dangled from her ears, communicating her wealth and status to the onlookers that had stopped to gawk at the visitors' exchange. I apologize, my lady. Eric bowed shallowly and allowed her to approach Kirk's table. Kirk sipped his flagon as she stepped in front of him. It is bold of you to assume you can teach my men a lesson. Astrid suppressed a laugh. It is bold of you to assume that I cannot. Kirk grinned and placed his drink on the stone table in front of her. He liked bold. What can I do for you, Astrid? She said with a deep breath, as she folded her cloak over her forearms. Astrid. Kirk echoed. Lord King Verduge of Karth, Warden of Grothin, the country you happen to be standing in. He motioned himself in the watching hall. Please, take a seat. Astrid reached across the table and touched the back of his hand, stopping him from sitting. I think you may want to hear what I say privately. She watched him stand straight once more with a nod. She could see his features closer now, deep and honest. She could see his soul lasting for centuries to come. Kirk wrapped his brown fur cloak over his shoulders and took his sword from the table, returning it to his side. Eric, he called as he prepared to leave. The blond man returned and handed him his gloves. I think our visitor would like to see the gardens. Eric eyed the brown woman watching them, unsure of leaving her alone with their lord. Are you sure, my lord? Sensing that the worry on Eric's face meant that they wanted privacy, Astrid stepped away to give them a moment together. She was sure he'd have more to say without her listening. Eric was grateful for the opportunity as she turned her back and waited by a pillar. He stepped closer and whispered fiercely to Kirk. I don't think you should be alone with her. She could be a witch. Kirk eyed her as she stood with her back turned. And what a lovely back it was. Kirk eyed her as she stood with her back turned. And what a lovely back it was. I should only hope so. It always seems that only witches and their ilk take a liking to me. Eric shook his head. Don't joke. You know your mother, your father. Yes, I'll be careful. Tomorrow, he said definitively as Eric agreed to meet then. Kirk looked at Astrid as she peered over her shoulder at him. If the barmaid had been pretty, Astrid's beauty was incomparable. Her curled hair shifted over her shoulder and fell to her rear, loosely controlled by a blue leather band that bound it halfway through. Shorter curls framed her smooth brown face with soft golden eyes that spoke of comfort. Her lips made a fine pear, the top a decadent candied brown and the bottom a blush stream. Astrid felt the tip of her lips curling with a smile. He was enraptured already. Before she saw him on the field of battle, she had thought he would be another self-important king with more children and money than he had sense. But here he stood, calm and controlled, with a better nature to him than she had seen in some time. She listened as his rich voice said his goodbyes and led her further into the warm hall, past the chaotic kitchen, and out of the open-air rear patio. The large brownstone pillars lining the entrance to the back garden held the day's warmth as the moon shone on the endless rows of water plants. Flourishing violets and cyans glistened as ever-trickling water gently swayed back and forth in the pond planters. Vines and tree branches curled and grazed the outer pillars surrounding the enclosure, whispering the wind's thoughts as the evening sang. Astrid looked awestruck. With the cool of the moon, his garden was no less than a fantasy. You're home. It's beautiful. Kirk looked out into the distance with her where the green hills protected the valley behind the castle and held them when it was time to sleep. You sound surprised. She laughed softly and shook her head. Surprised? No. But delighted. It reminds me of home. Astrid took Kirk's arm as he strolled with her through the garden, admiring the moon lilies and feeling the velvet of the soft green leaves as they brushed her arms. A frog crossed their path and bounded into the nearest hydrangea pot. Kirk smiled as the leap splashed her, giving her a cheerful laugh. He wondered about fate. Could he ever have foreseen a peaceful moment like this in the midst of the stench of death? Astrid broke their comfortable silence first. Are you typically so kind to mysterious visitors? That could prove to be a dangerous habit. Kirk gestured to a balcony just in front of them, overlooking the village valley. She released his arm as she leaned on the stone banister. I saw you that day, in the fields of Haverslav. Astrid raised her brows in shock. Such a bold accusation. How could she deny it? I'm not sure. Kirk cut off her stammer and kept his eyes on the valley. The wooden longhouses with cobblestone streets were quiet, lit with fires inside the homes. If he truly had never seen her before, he wouldn't have let her leave the front hall. He would do anything to protect his people. Your wings looked to be miles of the blackest silk. Your helm was gold and featured with horns aplenty, and orange fire poured from your fingers like streams. Kirk recalled seeing her in the distance, her brown hands held together in prayer and reaching to the sky in the rain. He had looked back one last time for survivors, but had found only her. It was not her first time seeing the casualties of war. I know what you are. Astrid searched his face for a hint of doubt. Say it, she challenged. My husband says that's a Twilight reference. I beg to differ. While many men upheld the faith that the Valkyries would be there to carry them to Valhalla, many did not have the ability to believe enough to see them. Kirk stared at her silently beneath his chin as she stepped closer. He was sure. The fire in her spirit, her cockiness and her power. She was the same being that had been at the battle that day. Valkyrie. She closed her eyes briefly as he said it to her. She was close enough to smell him now. His warm, spiced skin reminded her of clove. She could trust him with his knowledge. I know of you, too. Kirk held her eyes. Do you? How could she possibly? Astrid smiled and tapped the ledge anxiously with her palm. I do, and I was sent to assist you with your war efforts. Astrid waited as he thought carefully on her words. Mistrust was clear in his moon-streaked eyes. Would you like to see what I can do for you, Lord Veruke? She gathered her dress and began walking down the plant-covered staircase to the village. Kirk watched her as she descended. Why would you help me? Astrid looked back at him as he stood firm on the balcony, his cloak billowing behind him. He was as close to a hero as she thought a hero could be. Valor, looks, and highly suspicious. He was interesting indeed. Gold eyes met sterling silver, truth traded in their stalemate. Because our kind has to stick together.
My goodness, what a first part that was. And was that the whole chapter there, or are we still a little short from that second chapter?
I think we're a little short. We ended on page 31 for everyone following along in the book at home. And I think chapter 1 ends on 40-something, so we're almost there, not quite. We do have a bit of a journey ahead of us. We have 16 chapters, but I think we're gonna work through it pretty well here in time for something surprising at the end of the book. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. I think we should be able to get through this.
Yeah, I'm thinking at the end of this we're gonna be able to talk about some pretty exciting things, but it was quite a chapter. I remember a note that you had about Kirk and Astrid when you first read them was the instant love factor. The instant attraction factor. Is that still true?
I think so.
Do you think it's a negative for a story to have something like that, or do you think it just establishes, especially with a trope like Fated Lovers, that they were meant to be? You look gobsmacked.
Yeah.
And listeners, that is because Jake is not a romance man. Okay, he's not a romance man. That's okay. I'm romantic enough for the both of us. But kicking it off to the viewers with the question, I think we should start a poll. Are you into Fated Lovers? Instant love factor? Do you think it's a negative or a positive for a story? And again, if you want to read ahead, get the physical copy for yourself or the ebook, head to SlayerPublishing.com where all feature stories are available for you. And before we leave, a huge thank you and shout out to all the supporters that I've had over the years. I used to write on a free website called Literotica. That's where I kind of started, building up my confidence and posting for other people to see. And I have quite a few readers still who read my work, comment on things, review, and I just want to say thank you to each and every one of them. I know some names off the top of my head, like Dorian, Rose, just everyone from that space. It really just warms my heart hearing from you, and you have no idea how essential it is to me to keep going off of feedback like that. So, really, thank you so much. That just about wraps up the first episode of Empress Fiction. Hope you enjoyed it. Join us next time where we'll continue reading Bifrost and finish out this first chapter. See you then.